one essential for biohacking your energy. And I thought that was a bold statement because there were so many amazing presenters at the biohacking conference in Vegas, and they all had amazing pieces of the puzzle. And all of it is important. Nothing is not important. But by the time you're finished this presentation today, hopefully you'll understand why I called this the number one essential, because when you learn what the number one essential is, you'll realize that there's nothing more important than that when it comes to survival, let alone energy. So what I want to do is address that and leave you with some ahas and some ways to think about your fatigue that you're not getting from providers, so that ultimately you can get your health back. As far as biohacking, the term, if you're not aware of it, I'm sure you are. We talk about biohacking or just hacking, quick little ways to be able to improve your health and be able to optimize your health. And at the biohacking conference, I made the argument that most people get into the biohacking world, if you will, because their doctors have failed them and they're frustrated and they're not getting the answers they're looking for. And when they go to a biohacking conference, it's not so much to optimize their performance, it's to minimize their exhaustion. And so I know that one of the things that I said is we're looking to change the being on defense to moving on offense. So we're always picking and choosing what we can do when we're exhausted and tired. And when the doctors aren't giving you answers and they're telling you that nothing is wrong, that's not acceptable for you, because you know inherently that there is something wrong. So you look elsewhere and you go to a biohacking conference, but it's not so much for optimizing performance. We want to get to the offense so that we can have a superpowered, optimized life. But most of the time we're looking for being able to have enough energy to get out of bed and be motivated and driven and focused and concentrated and be able to get back to work and earn your independence and have purpose and meaning. Hopefully that's what you're looking for, and you're continuing to get some aha. So as far as this is a quote that I got from a book that I'll reference shortly here, but I quoted, "Life is the interplay between structure and energy, yet the role of energy deficiency in the human disease has been poorly explored by modern medicine." And that was coined by Dr. Douglas C. Wallace, who is the director of the Center for Mitochondrial and Epigenomic Medicine at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And the number one reason we go to see the doctor is when we are tired and exhausted and burnt out. That's the number one reason that we go. And medicine, I created an argument, is really awesome when it comes time to helping people that have acute problems, broken bones and strokes and ruptured spleens and, knock on wood, all of these things, heart attacks and aneurysms. But when it comes time to help you with exhaustion, fatigue, stress, family, finances, political, social isolation, work peers, physical traumas, environmental toxins, EMFs, the reality is all of those things are impacting your body at a level that's causing you to not be able to make energy at the level you need to. And that's not going to be fixed by a pill or a prescription or even a supplement. It's not. You have to put all the puzzle pieces together, and hopefully there's a changing of the tone of how medicine is being practiced. It certainly isn't healthcare, it's sickness care. And public health policies, with especially what's going on with pandemics and social isolations and mandated this, that, and the others, that is not public health. That's not preventative health. That's reactionary, fear-based health. So I don't want to get down that rabbit hole, but I want to go into this. I want to go right into the information, because I know when you're exhausted and burnt out, you want that information so that you can have your little ahas. So what I want you to do is have aha moments for this, maybe write it down and implement just one thing. I'll give you a quick little story. I used to follow a really well-known marketer in the field of internet. I wasn't even internet marketing. It was direct response marketing. So people that would do you get a mailer in the mail and you could send away money orders and stuff like that, or they would do these sales letters. And the man's name was Dan Kennedy. And I don't know if any of you know who Dan Kennedy is, but he talked about, he used to have these seminars in the 80s, and they would cost for a 3-day seminar in the 80s, and even early 80s, somewhere in the $10,000 to $15,000 at that time. And so he had someone come to his workshop, and they were full because he would give you so much value. And if you would just apply one thing, the return on investment has to be so that you're getting the value out of it. Anyways, he had a gentleman who left after the first half hour, and he thought, oh, I must have upset him, and he didn't like it, and he was going to ask for his money back because he probably got no value. So he ended up reaching out to the guy and asked him, why did you leave? Like, was everything okay? And he said, yeah, I left because I knew after that half hour, with that one little piece of information that you mentioned, I could apply that to my business. That was a major problem that I know as soon as I implement, we will triple, quadruple, 10 times what we're going to get for what we paid for this webinar, because that was the one concept. And I want you to walk away with that idea for this webinar, and not even that, but even with what you're doing when you're researching or when you're implementing things, is to think about it as Pareto's principle in what can you do that would give you 1% investment with the 99-cent return? Because ultimately it's the big rocks, it's the most important things that need to be addressed if you want to have an outcome that you're not having right now. So this webinar is for men and women that are stuck in overwhelm and burnout. They're still looking for answers, which means they've been searching for them. And like I said at the beginning, they're spending so much time on the internet and blog articles and podcasts and videos to be able to get answers. So I acknowledge your tenacity and your persistency and your desire, and keep honing in on knowing that you deserve to get healthy. You're searching and you know inherently something's wrong. And it's that puzzle piece that's keeping you from tapping into your hidden energy reserves. And if you've been struggling for a long time, or you've just been feeling stuck, then I really feel that this webinar is going to be for you. So let's get into it without further ado. What is the number one biohack? The number one biohack is harnessing oxygen. So remember what I said is that I call this the number one biohack because we need to learn how to make oxygen work for us and not against us. And that's not a concept that's not taught in traditional medical schools. And it's really not even taught in alternative medical schools. You have to understand biochemistry 101 and the physics and biology and organic chemistry to be able to get into those schools. But then when it's time to actually learn how to practice medicine, unfortunately, the FDA has a patent on the term medicine because it has to be a pharmaceutical that can be considered medicine. You can't call any other practice medicine if it's not an AMA patented pharmaceutical approach. And that's unfortunate because, again, I don't want to go down those rabbit holes, but ultimately how we produce energy at the cellular level is not taught and understood, and certainly can't be addressed from a pharmaceutical measure. And I'm sure you would echo that, in that the medications or the prescriptions may help you end your pain or manage your pain or control your blood sugar or whatever it may be, suppress your immune system, but it certainly isn't getting at the number one reason you're exhausted and tired. And that's what we'll talk about. It's about harnessing your oxygen and being able to move oxygen from one place to the next place and use that as a valuable, necessary resource for producing energy at the cellular level. That's the number one biohack, and probably the first time you might be hearing that. So what I want you to do though is connect the dots as what does stress have to do with it? What does stress have to do with harnessing your oxygen? Well, I use the analogy you may have heard earlier about a car that's in standard. It's a manual car and you have to switch from first gear to second gear. And when you're accelerating in first gear onto the highway, if you can't switch out of first gear and your RPMs are going through the roof, that engine's working really, really hard, but it's not able to move forward, and it's working a lot harder than engines that aren't working as hard and are moving faster and further. Stress to me is that engine that is stuck in first gear, and oxygen is the RPMs that's causing the car to not move forward and overheat and ultimately break down. If we are stressed, if there's social media and the way that news is biased, and there's not any minerals in our soils, and there's Wi-Fi, and there's chemicals and toxins, and everything that we get exposed to is ultimately causing your body to demand oxygen to be able to produce energy. I mean, it really comes down to that basic level. And so we need to figure out what goes wrong. Why are we not using oxygen for us? And why is it being used against us? And what is the relationship to stress? Because stress will just keep you running in the red. And thereby, if you're not producing energy from using oxygen, you're cashing in your mutual funds, which means you're using your sympathetic system to produce fake energy, which is ultimately going to create more problems. You're getting caffeine and stimulants and sugary foods and anything that can keep you running. And as a result, you just have that wired and tired, not able to get out of that first gear for no reason, or what it seems to be no reason. So I want you to connect the stress oxygen necessity together, because when you understand how stress impacts that equation, you can modulate that with a lot of different tools that we'll be teaching you at the end. So ultimately, if you get this right and you're harnessing your oxygen effectively, your energy will surge. However, if you don't, it will plummet, and it's either one or the other. So let's make sure it's surging and harnessing correctly. So my goal, or the goals of this presentation, is to have you learn how to get it right, how to harness your oxygen effectively, and also to have a paradigm shift, because we are focused on the diet, the next cleanse, the detox, the next supplement, the prescription, more exercise, more research. And those are not the Pareto principles of 1% yields 99% of your results. And it comes down to, how do you harness your oxygen? How do you modulate your O2? Meaning, how do you make the demand for energy production less through breathing, through controlling autonomically your stress response? And what I mean by that is they research monks that are really well trained in meditation, and they're able to get their heart rate lowered, get their pulse rate lowered, get their temperature lowered. When you're dialed in on your autonomic nervous system, or at least your breath work, and on what's going on in your body, you're able to control things that we're told that you can't control. We weren't ever really taught you can control your autonomic nervous system. That's why it's called that. You can't decide to tell your heart to beat. It's going to beat anyways, and it will. But certainly we're meant to be in tune with our body. And when we have all these stimuli coming at us left, right, and center, you are not aware of your oxygen demand and your ability to modulate that. And then ultimately that allows you to optimize your energy. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys, and I'll just keep moving forward. This was one of the quizzes that I have, just a multiple choice test to get you guys to understand why I called this the number one biohack more than anything else, is the 4 essentials of life. So you only get one choice. You only get to pick the main thing that would be able to keep you alive, that has the most, I guess, the most weighted importance. So the first one is food. You get to decide, okay, is food going to be your choice to keep you alive? Are you going to choose water to keep you alive? Are you going to choose shelter to keep you alive? Or I joked around, are you going to choose scuba diving to keep you alive? But no, the real thing is air, right? I mean, so what they talk about is they talk about you can survive without food for 30 days plus or minus. You can survive without water for 3 days plus or minus. They also talk about you can survive with elements, whether it's cold out or too hot out, for maybe no more than 3 hours. And then some people say 3 minutes, but if you ask the people that can do those free diving competitions, I mean, those guys are amazing. They can hold their air for up to 4 or 5 minutes, but typically it's no longer than 4 or 5 minutes. So ultimately, if we don't have oxygen, let alone the ability to use it to produce energy, your cells won't survive, plain and simple. So that's why it's the number one biohack is, how are you using your oxygen? How are you able to produce energy with the presence of oxygen? And we'll get into that in a second. So that's why we call this the number one essential biohack, is being able to harness your oxygen. And you can't have a conversation without talking about the mitochondria. And I'm sure you've heard of that, like the mitochondria, it's the power plant of the cell. And it has all of these nice buzzwords. And even traditional doctors are understanding the importance of mitochondrial health. And I've listened to a lot of books that talk about mitochondrial health, but they're not talking about cellular respiration. They're talking about mitochondria. And what's really interesting is a mentor, Morley Robbins, which we'll be referencing here in a little bit, uses the analogy of, everyone talks about mitochondria. That's kind of like the car, but the oxygen and the minerals is the key that makes the car turn on. And you will be surprised now that, well, won't be surprised, the information that I know now when I hear the specialists talk about, and the ones that are well known in the industry talk about mitochondrial health, they're not talking about respiration. They're not talking about mineral balance. They're not talking about iron and copper and magnesium. They're talking about mitochondrial supplements and doing CoQ10 and NAD. And there's some sophisticated supplements for sure, but they're not talking about how does it actually, what are the keys to the engine? What actually turns it on and works? And that's what I want you to learn today. And it really does have to do with bioavailable copper. I'll teach you by the time you're done this presentation today, how to think about optimizing your mitochondrial health, how to have the keys to the engine, how to produce ATP to be able to overcome your exhaustion and your fatigue. So before I do that, a little bit about myself. Who am I, and why should you be listening to me? Maybe you don't know who I am, or maybe you do, but I suffered with my own health challenge that I came to learn was something that was called adrenal fatigue. Now, one of the things I would like to stress is that, yes, while we're exhausted and tired and not getting answers and going to different doctors and wanting for them to tell us and put their finger on what we're dealing with, the diagnosis doesn't matter. It doesn't. The diagnosis very rarely, if ever, tells you what's the dysfunction in the body. And no more is that true with the term adrenal fatigue. It's a horrible, horrible name. The adrenals don't typically fatigue, and if they do, it's called adrenal insufficiency. And that's what created the Hatfields versus the McCoys, if you will, where the traditional doctors and the Endocrine Society and the AMA, they're not taught what adrenal fatigue, the term that we think about at the, let's call it the internet level, is really a phenomena. They're taught as early as the 1890s. There's this thing called Addison's disease, and it was coined after Dr. Addison, where the body is not producing any cortisol because of an autoimmune disease, and it's such a rare thing, 1 in 100,000. And there's hyperpigmentation, and there's a lot of major classical uh, findings that aren't represented in the term adrenal fatigue. And if you guys want a free report on the why doctors don't accept it, and it gets a little bit more into that, I made a report, and when we get to the end of the webinar, I'll show you where you can get that, because I think that will give you a little bit of light on the history of adrenal fatigue. And so either way, I was finished my graduate program, and we were studying long hours, and I had basically an IV of caffeine plugged into my veins, and we were studying very long hours. And then obviously our circadian rhythms weren't in balance, because we would be pulling all-nighters, and then we would be in class and we didn't get a lot of light, and then we were over exercising, and then there's exams and finals, and the stress of having to do well. And I was done. I was brain fogged. My wife was pregnant with twins, and we almost lost the twins, and I moved to a new state, let alone a new country, and I was in debt over $250,000. And I injured my back, and I what have these twins, and my wife got through the pregnancy, and we moved to a new state and opened up my own practice, and I couldn't get out of bed. I was exhausted, I was tired, I was brain fogged, I didn't have motivation and drive. I was relying on caffeine to give me a little bit of up, but then that mid-afternoon lull, and then libido and motivation and drive and all of that. Where were my car keys, and where was my wallet? It was just a mess. And I went to doctors, and as much as they're well intended, they told me nothing was wrong with me. Your blood tests are normal. And then I had a patient of mine, and he brought a book called in Why Do You Have Thyroid Symptoms Even Though Your Blood Tests Are Normal? And I didn't even read it probably for almost a year, and then finally got over to the book, opened it up, got to the section on adrenal fatigue, and it was like an epiphany. It was like, oh my gosh, this is describing me to a T. Blood sugar imbalances, hormonal, all the things that I just mentioned. And I thought, I've never heard of this. I have a psychology degree, I have an exercise physiology degree, I had graduated with a doctorate in chiropractic. And I don't say that to brag. I say that because I had studied a lot of stuff, and I'd never heard of this before. And so that was like the epiphany of, oh my gosh, if I have this, and this is based on stress and caffeine and studying and multitasking and just being overwhelmed with life, having a demand for oxygen that at a crazy amount than your supply is going to deliver, you're not going to produce energy at the level that you need to. And I kept going down these rabbit holes and rabbit holes and rabbit holes, and started to agree. You know what? I was mad at the beginning when doctors were saying that there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue. Of course there is. I'm exhausted, I'm tired. But the problem is that up to 90% of the problems that occur with the adrenals occur outside of the adrenals. So what that means is the brain and the things that stimulate the brain to signal, and then the actual hormone that's released, and the feedback loops, and then does it get into the cell, and does it get more deactivated, or there are more binding proteins that don't. Those aren't things you're going to see on a saliva test, but they're real. And then they come up with a term called HPA axis dysfunction. And even that doesn't answer the question, because at the end of the day, when you're fatigued, to me, simple is better. The whatever the principle is of of whatever's the easiest explanation of something, that's the more real explanation of something. And ultimately, you don't have to convince someone, whether the doctor believes that an adrenal fatigue thing is real or not, that they simply are not making energy at the level they need to. That's what it comes down to, is you don't have energy. You don't have energy. And we're not talking about energy to run a marathon. We're talking about energy to coordinate your cells, your organs, your systems, tissues, to run as an orchestra, and to give feedback and communicate, and to create uh, respiration, and to get the heart to beat, and to be able to change the temperature when it's cold, or warm the temperature when it's, or cool down when it's hot, or digest your food. These are what we're talking about. And when you don't have energy enough to meet the demand, you are going to pay a, a prioritization, right? You're not going to say, okay, we need to have another baby, so reproduction is important. So what happens when females are overstressed or they're too overtrained? They don't have their cycles. What happens to men when they are overstressed or overtrained, or just their demand doesn't meet, the supply doesn't meet the demand? Is their libido goes, their hormones aren't balanced, because that's not important right now. What's important is survival. What's important is, as if this were you and your job, you're not buying new shoes and going out for restaurants and going on vacation. You're saying, do I pay for the power, or do I get food on the table? Or hopefully I could get both. Same thing in your body. Do I regulate my temperature and my heart rate and be able to get my respiratory function working and my blood pressure? And that's called POTS syndrome. Where on earth does POTS describe the physiology of what's going on? It doesn't. It's more of, let's give you this pill or supplement and not address the root cause of the problem. But ultimately, the whole point is the simplicity is best. You're not making energy at the level that you need to. And when we get into harnessing oxygen, oxygen is what's required to make the most amount of energy. That's a biochemical fundamental law. There's nothing to debate about that. So my mission now is to expose the truth about adrenal fatigue, so that we can empower 100 million people to go from exhausted to energized. And it is really a perfect storm, where we're getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And I say it's the best of the best and the worst of the worst. We have all of these things with COVID and isolation and all the things we talked about earlier, coupled with the genetics. And I do a lot of genetic work, and what I've learned is, if you would have lived 400 years ago, you wouldn't probably have all these health challenges that you have now. And our survival of inheritable genes that make it more likely for us to survive get passed down from the next to the next. And I'll give you an example. One of the main enzymes that is majorly altered, meaning there's some challenges, we call them mutations or polymorphisms, where when you pass that down, this particular enzyme called HFE, you tend to absorb iron more. And we see a lot of Europeans and British and Irish and German descent that tend to have these HFE enzymes that are polymorphic, which means they overabsorb iron. That would have been very, very advantageous for survival in the potato famine, and when food wasn't readily available, especially for moms to maintain their pregnancies and be able to have oxygen ultimately be delivered more effectively, if we're not putting enriched iron filings in our foods. However, these same genetic susceptibilities that were passed on to increase our likelihood of procreation now decrease our likelihood of procreation, because we as men can't, and women, man, can't get out of our own way, in the sense that we pollute the environment, we wreck our ecosystem in the quest for monetary purposes. And what happens is, we thought it would be a great idea to put iron filings in food because, quote unquote, there's this thing called iron deficiency, and we need to put these iron filings in foods so that we can be a public health department and make sure we ensure the health of our citizens. I would say that that's not the altruistic reason. In fact, I'd say there's more nefarious goals when that is in mind. But let's say you have that HFE enzyme where it doesn't work at full capacity, you tend to overabsorb iron, and there's iron filings in the food. Does that gonna help you survive, or is it not? So what I find is it's the perfect storm of environmental triggers and genetic susceptibilities that were once favorable for survival are a little more tricky, that can create major health challenges and or create energy supply and demand problems. So hopefully that made sense. And it really goes deeper than the adrenal fatigue. It goes deeper than the HPA axis. At the fundamental level, it goes that you're not producing energy at the level that you need to. You're not harnessing your oxygen. So the changing book for me was Morley's book. And Sharon, I see that you raised your hand, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to have these questions answered at the end, if that's okay. But I'm glad to see where you're calling in from. So, and David, I hope you're doing well. I haven't seen you for a while. So as far as the game changer, this book was the game changer for me. So I had already been going down these rabbit holes and doing these genetic interpretations on people and realizing that it's not an adrenal fatigue problem. It's not an HPA axis problem. It's not even a mitochondrial problem, in the sense that you won't say that the car is the reason why it's not driving. You would say the key that's not turning the car is the reason that it's not driving. And so I would say that it's an energy problem because you're not able to harness your oxygen. And I was already going down these rabbit holes and doing genetic testing and finding out that myself included have these gene SNPs for iron metabolism issues, plus the environment that we live in, plus copper metabolism issues. And on top of that, then we have all of this oxidative stress that we're not able to extinguish as effectively. I picked up Morley's book, and it was like an epiphany about this guy. Morley has been doing research for 12 years, 2 hours a day, combing through the research of peer-reviewed journals that are not available, not taught. They are suppressed and almost purposely not talked about. And there's no debating these research articles, and these are done by the most prestigious people, Krebs and Otto Warburg and so many other people that were in this field of studying how energy is produced, only to find out that it hasn't been what we've been told. And copper and iron and magnesium and ceruloplasmin, I can't get into that for this purpose of this call today. I can do some additional webinars, but I would, if you haven't had a chance to read that, suggest that you do. And you can see the subtitle is How Balancing 3 Minerals and 1 Protein is the Solution That You've Been Looking For. Now, it's a nice primer. It's a root cause protocol in terms of you address these major things, then you could start layering on some of the other consequences of those. Meaning, if you're not breathing at the cellular level effectively and your demand and supply is not being met, and your demand is higher than your supply, and you've been paying prioritization and paying Peter to rob Paul for this, that, and the other, and you have all these unpaid expenses that haven't been addressed, those are going to create some turmoil when you haven't addressed those expenses. Our body says, okay, I don't need this for survival today, but I do need that for survival tomorrow. And that's where those consequences happen. Hence, you see thyroid function go down, you see hormone function, you see adrenal function, you see immune system, you see chemical buildup. And those are things that are going to be needed to be addressed, but they're not addressed first. And so that's why it's called that root cause protocol. And when we work with our clients one-on-one, we prioritize that, and then we focus on the consequences, the effects. And I want you to understand that it's the effects, not the causes. And that's the downstream from getting your cells to breathe effectively. So why do I have this quote here, moving from 6th standard deviation to 1st standard deviation? So after I read this book, this is the type of person I am. It's like, okay, I got to call Morley. I'm not, maybe there's some insecurities in other ways, but I'm not insecure enough as a doctor to say, hey, I don't know it all. And this is exactly what I've been looking for to understand what's going on. These are some major ahas and things that are really shading in the colors of gray to that answer a lot of things that I had in my head that really needed a little bit of 1 or 2 or 3 other just standard deviations away from what I had already known. But I called him up and I said, hey, Morley, do you know Bob Miller? He has this amazing program that I've been doing genomic interpretations from, that I've seen a lot of the things that you've talked about in other areas, and energy production, and copper keeps coming back and iron keeps coming back. And your book has been amazing for me, and it's helping me help other people. But do you know this Bob Miller guy? Because I think you should know. And so I know Bob. Bob is a 6 standard deviation guy, and I'm a 1 standard deviation guy. And I thought about that for a second, and it goes down to the guy who left the $10,000 seminar and realized that he had all the information he needed, and the same thing. So it's great to go on the internet. It stinks at the same time because you haven't found a doctor that will do it for you. But I'm guessing in a small way, or even a large way, you've resonated with the information and you find it fascinating. And you, if you had the ability to have your energy back, maybe would want to be a health coach or be an example for other women that have children and have had to balance their demands and work and parenting and spousing with their fatigue issues, and they want to teach other women how to do that, or they want to be able to help the other people that have suffered with the same thing, give them solutions that they were able to figure out themselves. And or you want to have integrity, you want to show other people that you can help them, but if you don't have your own health helped, how can you have integrity for them to believe you? It's like I say, it's like the poor financial planner, or even the really obese, out of shape trainer. Now, again, I think that they can be very good at what they do, but you really are a message of communication integrity when you own what you teach. And so anyways, back to the 6 standard deviation. I thought about it for a while, and I thought, well, the 1 standard deviation is a really good way to say, get at the main thing that's going to make the biggest difference. And I still do interpretations because I know once we get the cells respiring effectively and get the oxygen producing and making sure that your bioavailable copper is preserved and your magnesium burn rate is stabilized. And those are deeper concepts that Morley teaches on the root cause protocol. But once that happens, we're going to need to do the gut establishment, and we're going to need to be able to get your circadian rhythm online. We're certainly going to need to balance your limbic center and your brain and your emotional and frontal cortex that's been post-traumatically impacted by all of the fatigue and traumas you've experienced by not having your health. And we're going to have to also make sure your blood sugar is stable and make sure you're able to produce ketones and be able to get into autophagy. But at the end of the day, the 1st standard deviation is getting your cells breathing more effectively. So to the next slide. This slide I put on here because if you accept the fact that energy demand is exceeding energy supply and you're not producing ATP at the cellular level, you basically have a demand and supply problem. It's like a balance sheet. You are expending more expenses, or you're spending on more than you're bringing in. And in this I should have found one that the liabilities are actually more on this diagram, but you get what I was saying is that the assets are less than your expenses. And when that happens, your body, as a metabolic analogy, has to make priorities. And ultimately, when you do get the demand and supply equaling each other, your body has the intelligence to know what to do with that. Your body is, that's where the one standard deviation is really important too, where once your body has the information from a metabolic standpoint to pay back the bills and the creditors, then it will start to do and fill up the buckets that it needs to fill up. It will increase your detox capacity when you're ready. It will help your metabolism release fat when you're ready. Because if you're not, that's a big reason for weight loss resistance, is because your body stores toxins and chemicals and nasty things that when they're liberated will overburden your body. And if you don't have enough downstream energy for your liver and your kidney and your skin and your lymph and your oxygen release, then you're not gonna release it. Your body's smart at that. So the bottom line is let the body do what it needs to do, and don't expect that you can outsmart it with a supplement or a medication. It's a really a really important lesson I learned. My wife was pregnant with twins, and we had a really smart PhD, MD endocrinologist in LA. And I'll never forget, I was still going through school, and I asked him, I said, how will we know when we're out of the woods? Because it was a high risk pregnancy, and when can we undo the top button and take a breath out and not be on our toes and being your nails out and stuck to the ceiling 24/7? How will we know when we're out of that? And he says, the body as doctors, we don't know as much about the body as the body knows about the body. And that always stuck with me. I was like, yeah, that's an insightful comment, that when your body has the energy, it knows what to do with it. Don't try to micromanage it. I always say, don't trip over dollars to save pennies. Don't do it. Let the body do the work. So that's when I went down the rabbit holes, and that's what I'm sharing with you guys tonight. This has been years and years of figuring this out and really getting some ahas about this. But ultimately, how does the body make energy? When we harness oxygen, what's going on there and how do we do it? So just a quick lesson, Energy Production 101. The food you eat with the air you breathe equals ATP and water. Again, I'm for simplicity. When you combine the food you eat and the air you breathe, you will produce energy. If you produce enough energy, your energy will be higher than your demand, and your body will know what to do with it. Now, that means we have to have good quality foods. We have to have good quality air. We have to have good quality microbiome. All of those things are important, but the general formula is the energy you produce is dependent on the food you eat with the air you breathe to produce ATP and water. And that's another thing. When you see people that are exhausted and tired, they're dehydrated, because one of the byproducts of combining hydrogen and oxygen in the food you eat, it produces H2O. And if it doesn't, then your adrenal system will say, hey, aldosterone, release, and let's make sure we retain our sodium and release potassium so we don't have our blood pressure go too low. And then over time, the minerals completely become imbalanced because you're not producing not just ATP, you're not producing water. So if that's not happening, you're oxidizing, right? If you're not producing ATP and combining the food you eat with the air you breathe, something's happening to that oxygen, but it's not ATP, it's oxidation. And what happens, you got to think about it in terms of, again, you're either using oxygen for you or you're not using it for you. Now, there's a theory, the mitochondrial theory of aging, where Dennis Harmon, who was an engineer and applied a lot of those engineering sciences to the physical body and exhaust, and when a car spits out exhaust, that's what oxidation is. Now, it's an important process when your mitochondria is using the minerals effectively and being able to harness oxygen and being able to have copper available to bounce on those mitochondrial complexes and produce magnesium and ATP. It's going to produce a certain byproduct of exhaust. There's going to be a certain amount of ROSs, or reactive oxidative species, that come off that complex. If there's no ceruloplasmin to be able to clean that exhaust, you're going to have way more exhaust. Now, I talked to Morley and I said, I think that we're not meant to burn 100% clean. We're not meant to be Teslas in the sense that you don't produce any exhaust. I think that when we start to produce exhaust and we don't have bioavailable copper and ceruloplasmin to protect the free radicaling of ATP, and that produces exhaust, if that's happening all the time, you're never going to have signaling molecules. So when that exhaust is produced and it says, hey, there's stress here, there's smoke coming out, get the immune system working, harness the hounds, release the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, get them. We need a certain amount of, that's why they suggest you shouldn't be taking antioxidants all the time, because free radicals are signalers of autophagy and signalers of cleansing and clearing and responding. But it's like the principle has to be, there's the perfect bell-shaped curve. If there's too much, then you're oxidizing. If there's not enough, then you're not signaling. Does that make sense? But at the end of the day, for this lesson, I didn't mean to get too much in the weeds. The oxidation is rust. And I'm telling you what's happening is when you're tired and you're fatigued and you're burned out, you're not producing ATP at the level that you need to, you're rusting on the inside. Who's ever told you that? You're rusting on the inside. So the number one biohack, and I'll explain that in detail a little bit more, is you need, in order to have more energy, you harness your oxygen. You create energy and you clear exhaust. You modulate the demand and supply for oxygen. That's your oxygen consumption rate. And you do all of this by modulating or optimizing your bioavailable copper. So let's get into that a little bit, not too much, because I know this is a lot of information and a lot of the times you'll be tired after this is done. But bioavailable copper is an essential trace mineral, and energy cannot happen without it. Your energy complexes need it. Your mitochondria needs copper to power the ability of electrons to produce ATP. Look at a plug outlet and you'll see a copper wire around it because it allows for the current to be able to be discharged. And the science fact about it is that there is the ability to hold 2 electrons when most elements can only hold 1 electron. And ultimately what that means is it's able to quench free radicals. It's able to donate an electron to be able to clear the exhaust. That's one thing that I want to talk to you about. It also is essential for your antioxidant response elements, your firefighters. It supports your immune system. It aids in red blood cell and heme formation. It supports neutrophils, bone, collagen, connective tissue, preventing of genetic disorders. But where I want to explain to you is just a little more science, and forgive me just a little bit here in terms of energy production 101. So you have glycolysis, is where we ferment glucose or we produce very little bit of ATP. And the analogy I use is that's just being able to use kindling or use the leaves just to create that quick little release, that little fire that ultimately you hope to light the log. So it's a sustained fire. It goes through Krebs cycle, which is also known as citric acid cycle. And then it goes through the oxidative phosphorylation, which is really where you use oxygen to produce ATP. And copper is dependent in that main process. So this is just a quick little explanation of, if you produce ATP through glycolysis, you only yield 2 units of ATP. If you produce ATP through oxidative phosphorylation, when you use oxygen and copper, you produce 36 ATPs, up to 36 ATPs. So that's a factor of 18. So I've made a webinar saying, learn how to 18 times your energy by using your oxygen more effectively. That's not a fancy 18 times sounds like a good marketing number. It's more of, that's reality, that's science. You can produce up to 16 times, sorry, 16. I should say, that's a mistake there. I just caught that. Should be 18 times. I must have been tired. I caught my own mistake. But anyways, you can produce up to 18 times more energy. And so where does bioavailable copper where does it come in? Well, in order for you to actually produce that ATP in water, in order to combine hydrogen and oxygen, it's a copper dependent reaction. Or once the water is produced, it enables the release of something called ADP, which again is a copper dependent reaction. And then lastly, in order for ADP to become magnesium ATP, it's a copper dependent reaction. And then lastly, when all of that is happening, if you want to burn a clean fuel and you don't want to have a lot of exhaust coming off of that, you need to have ceruloplasmin to protect that process. So those 4 key processes, those are essential for you to produce 18 times more energy. And that's probably all you need to know. You can get into the weeds if you want to, but if you're short of energy, I urge you not to spend it on that theory there. I also explained it a little bit further is think of ceruloplasmin as the taxi cabs that help to taxi copper. And that means that ceruloplasmin is dependent on copper for it to drive. Like taxi cabs are dependent on occupants to be able to pay their bills. So copper is necessary for ceruloplasmin to work harmoniously together to be able to regulate iron transportation. So this was kind of a if this, then that kind of theory. So I want you to stick with me. So if copper is necessary for ceruloplasmin to work, and ceruloplasmin taxis copper in the body, and ceruloplasmin also allows iron to get transported, and then iron, of course, binds to oxygen in the red blood cells, then all of that is dependent on copper, right? Because ceruloplasmin requires copper. Ceruloplasmin gets iron to go into the blood and bind to oxygen, and ceruloplasmin requires copper. So in order for copper to get iron to get into the blood to bind oxygen, you need copper. So at the end of the day, copper is the thing that harnesses oxygen. It's not to be debated. It's science 101 that's not being taught. So let me ask you, you might be asking, well, what goes wrong? Why is there not available copper? And how do we ensure that energy is produced effectively or efficiently? Don't we just take mitochondrial supplements? Isn't that the way we do it? Well, since the 30s, the soils have been depleted with copper, and glyphosates or Roundup or pesticides are known to be major copper chelators, getting rid of copper. And then on top of that, high fructose corn syrup and oils and even supplementations and synthetic vitamins will all deplete your bioavailable copper. And on top of that, you're getting enriched iron in your foods. It's creating a perfect storm. And ultimately, what Morley says is if you don't have enough bioavailable copper in your body, not only are you not producing energy, but you're creating the problem with not allowing iron to move out of tissues, which is causing oxygen to combine with that iron, and you're rusting on the inside. That is really what is happening. But the problem is you can store up to 10 times more iron in your tissues. So you would be looked at as if you can't get iron out of your tissues, you may have been told that you have an iron deficiency and you've been put on iron supplements, or you've had iron transfusions, or you've had fibroids or endometriosis or hysterectomies. If you have any of those and you have been told that you have an iron deficiency, you don't have an iron deficiency per se. You have an iron dysregulation secondary to a copper bioavailability problem, causing your iron to get stuck in tissues and causing you to rust on the inside. That's really what's happening. And as a result, you're producing expense. You're not getting energy produced, so you're not making an income. So the analogy, and I use this over and over again, is it's not only bad enough that you don't have energy being produced, but it's injury into insult because you're rusting on the inside, which is oxidizing, which is using up your expenses or adding to your expenses. So I use the example, come work for me for a week, and at the end of the week, instead of me cutting you a paycheck, you owe me an invoice for the pleasure of working for me. That's what's happening in your body. And you wonder why we're exhausted and tired, and why the adrenal supplements or the hormones or the fill in the blank isn't working. No one's telling you this. So so it's ultimately comes down to the depletion of bioavailable copper. And that will cause an increase in your magnesium depletion. That will create lots of mineral imbalances. And then your body goes into prioritization mode. And what do we need to do to just keep the lights on? And let's throw some oil at the fire and give you more iron. It's sometimes absurd. So this is a new slide that I didn't talk about at the biohacking conference, but the old approach for fatigue is basically let's maybe give you some mitochondrial nutrients, which can be good in time, but not if it doesn't increase the bioavailability of copper. Let's give you hormones, and let's give you estriol and testosterone or aromatase inhibitors or thyroid hormones or prednisone, or let's give you a cookie cutter, just do the same blood tests over and over again, which are always limited, and you're told you're normal, and you have to fight tooth and nail to add some other fancy marker like insulin or reverse T3 on your markers, only to be told that there's nothing wrong with you, or just take this or that. Or the reductionistic approach, hey, let's do a saliva test, and let's say your saliva is low, you have low cortisol, so let's just boost it by giving you licorice root or glandular or ashwagandha, and everything's fine, like you wave a magic wand. Or let's give you other adrenal supplements. And again, I'm not against these, but I've been there, done that. And I'm sure maybe that's one of the reasons you're on this webinar is that this is not the answer. And yeah, I've done this and it doesn't work. Or you go to the doctors, internal medicine, psychologists, rheumatologists, cardiologists, immunologists, endocrinologists, I mean, all of them can be valuable. But the problem is with specialization, no one is talking to anyone. And the body, the last time I checked, doesn't specialize. It has cells and tissues and organs that come together. And really, there's this brand new science of neuro, psycho, immuno, gastro. You can fill in the blank that all your systems are communicating at the cellular level, and all the systems are one of the same. And yet we've decided to do this division of labor, which again, great when it comes to acute-based medicine, horrible when it comes to chronic health illnesses. Pharmaceutical approaches, again, it has a time and place: medications, narcotics, painkillers, anti-inflammatories, antidepressants, anti-anxiety, sleeping pills, seizure medications, SSRIs, SSNI or SRNIs, or MAOs, or blood pressure, or cholesterol, or metformin, or appetite suppressants. Or why don't we just do the eggs in one basket approach, where we do the liver detox, or the heavy metal, or the EBV, or the food elimination, or the new diet, or the new juice cleanse. I mean, again, it's frustrating for me because I know that it's a short-term fix, and a lot of the times we only do it because insurance pays for it. And when it comes, I got to share a story. If he's listening to this, I hope he is, because it's very frustrating to me. But I have someone that has emailed me. I've had 2 calls with him about helping him get his health back. And I would love your feedback and opinion on this, because I would like to know. However, he's worse than he's ever been. And I've given him an option to get better that insurance doesn't pay for. And it's not a light investment. And so ultimately, he's telling me he's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And I said, well, why don't we do some work? And he says, well, I just don't have the funds to do that. I look at it as, you just don't have the funds not to do that, because your life is on the line. And at what point do you decide that you don't have the funds? And I get it. Like I went to school in Canada. I grew up, and I got in debt over $250,000, and the Canadian dollar was 67 cents to the American dollar when I went to school. And so I was getting 2/3 of what my dollar was giving me. So I had to take out more loans. And then when I went to pay back the loan, the Canadian dollar was actually more than the American dollar. So now when I'm paying back my loans, I got double whammied. I don't think that's ever happened. But anyways, the whole point is that it wasn't an option for me. I knew that it was going to be a return on investment. I had burned the boats and didn't turn back, because I knew I had to get my health back. And my friend, I was my best man to my marriage. And he said, what are you doing? Like, what happens if you don't finish this? And I was like, you know what? I haven't even considered that. I didn't think that was an option for me. I had already assumed I was already going to finish. I didn't even assume, I already knew I was going to finish this. And it's frustrating to me because I've looked in the mirror and been in that situation where, in this case, in this gentleman, when your quality of life and your independence and your longevity and your ability to have a purposeful life, to me, you should do whatever you can. And on top of that, figure out what else you can on top of what you figuring that you haven't figured out what you can, because there's nothing more important than your health. Ask Steve Jobs how well his portfolio is looking. You know, if you don't take that with you, it just, I don't know. Maybe I digress. I'd love to hear your opinion on that. I mean, you don't have it, you don't have it. But at the same time, I didn't get the sense that he was willing to do whatever he could do to be able to have it. And I was, yeah, whatever. I'm sorry I sort of digressed there. But the new way is, it's frustrating for me when I know I could help you and I'm caring more about you getting better than you getting better. I've done that so many times. That's what led to me to be exhausted and burnt out in the first place, is because I'll care just as much as you to get better, but I'm not going to care more than you, because that's like someone dragging you in when you're drowning and throwing you a life preserver and you're kicking and screaming saying, no, I don't want to come in. Like, listen, I'm throwing you a preserver here. We got to get you better. I'm not going to try harder than you. And it's just one of those things where I wish I could help everyone that I know I could help. But so the old way was what we talked about. The new way is, you don't need another shiny object. You don't need another miracle supplement. You don't need another fancy test or doctor visit. You basically just need to recalibrate your mitochondria. Stop depleting your bioavailable copper. That means taking things that deplete your bioavailable copper. And Morley has a whole protocol. You can go and see, it's called the root cause protocol. And they tell you to stop taking iron and synthetic B vitamins and calcium and zinc and vitamin D and vitamin C synthetic. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of controversy, but those are things that really drain your bioavailable copper. But don't forget, your oxygen consumption rate is going to drain your bioavailable copper. And rebalance your minerals, deliver oxygen to your cells and tissues and organs of your body. Stop creating oxidative stress. Again, everything to do with oxygen consumption rate and harnessing 3 important minerals in terms of oxygen, iron, magnesium, and then 1 protein, ceruloplasmin. And when you do that, you establish mitochondria recalibration. And I call it, you can create energy on demand. So that is the #1 biohack for harnessing your oxygen. Is copper via ceruloplasmin regulates iron metabolism. Iron transports RBCs and harnesses oxygen. So therefore, copper harnesses oxygen. And if you're not doing that, you're creating rust. You're creating oxidation of iron. You're rusting on the inside, and you have to make sure you have bioavailable copper in order to do that. So my goal for the call today was teach you how to manage your oxygen consumption rate and how to get that right, and to give you paradigm shifts and to learn how to harness your oxygen and to optimize your energy production. As far as solutions, so really the oxygen consumption rate, that really comes down to being able to, your body doesn't know the difference between a stressor that's perceived or a stressor that's real. And I use the example, what happens if I told you, Mrs. Jones, that you have a winning lottery ticket and you now have $100 million? How would your life be different? And we start to imagine, we start to let our shoulders down. We think about what we would do with that, but we didn't actually get the money yet. We flipped the switch on a paradigm, and we have the ability to harness frequencies for energy production, which means thought processes and oxygenation and understanding that when things happen to you, you're going to have a natural sympathetic response. But if you can modulate the demand for oxygen, control your breathing, understand that this is for my highest purpose, that this too shall pass. I understand it's not easy to do in the moment, but that's a learned skill. Energy production 101, understanding that it comes down to making sure that we are harnessing our oxygen. Iron dysregulation, there's a huge difference between not getting iron out of tissues versus having iron deficiency. If you have an iron deficiency, or they've told you it's an iron deficiency problem, realize it's an iron dysregulation problem, which is secondary to a bioavailable copper problem. Minerals have been long depleted in our soils. Most coppers, people don't realize this, if not all coppers in supplements are copper 2, our copper 2, and really our body needs copper 1. And if it's copper 2, what happens is it's already oxidized. It can't get into the cell. So what happens is you have this paradox of too much copper that's not usable extracellularly and not enough intracellularly. And that gets stuck, and that can be sometimes the reasons why doctors say, oh, copper is bad for you, because a lot of times there's not the copper pipe problem everywhere and ubiquitous. It's potentially the fact that there's not ideal, usable, reduced copper that's available for you. And you're also doing things that are depleting your bioavailable copper in the environment, and glyphosates and sugary foods, and burning oxygen up because you're going a mile a minute and you can't regulate your sympathetic nervous system. It's a catch-22. I realize that, but there's a lot of tools you can do. And so now it comes down to how can I help you? Well, my goal is to give you information like this, and I plan to have a weekly masterclass or bi-monthly masterclass. But I do offer the ability to you and I jump on a call and really have a conversation about what's going on with you, what's causing your extrinsic oxygenation depletion, or what's increasing your oxygen consumption rate externally, what's impacting your oxygen consumption rate internally. How can we teach you how to harness your oxygen to 18 times your energy so that you can create energy on demand? And I always say, whatever your biggest challenge is, we've seen it. I have the crazy, tough, perfect storm, can't write a movie script more crazy than some of the things we work with our clients with. But your body's incredibly forgiving if you keep it simple. And one of the simple things is you're not producing energy at the level that you need to. Another simple thing is you have too much of something your body doesn't want and not enough of what your body does want. And we need to figure that out. So what we do is we figure out, where are you now? Where do you want to be? And what do you need to do to bridge that gap so that you can have energy year after year? And that cost is absolutely free. There's no obligation to do any work with us whatsoever. However, there is a catch. The catch is you need to be serious. You need to have a deep desire to end it once and for all. You need to have what we talked about resonate with you and know inherently that that makes sense to you, and you haven't been told about this before, and you feel that if you were to be able to identify the missing puzzle pieces and get to the majority of the root cause of the problem, look at your genetic susceptibilities, and then figure out what the consequences of that have been, your circadian rhythm, your blood sugar, your microbial health, your detoxification pathways. Need to figure all that things out, because your doctors aren't doing that. And then once we figure out what that would look like, I'll tell you down to the dollar what it would look like for us to work one-on-one, so that really you can take over the user manual and the cockpit to be able to navigate yourself and enjoy the life on your terms. But you have to be coachable, and you have to be decisive, knowing that this is a problem, and you have to be willing to do whatever you can to get it right. Because like when I invested in my education, I knew that the return of investment, not even just financially, but knowing that I wanted to have purpose and meaning. And there's nothing more rewarding to me to help someone get their health back. That's more than gold. And it really, you need to understand that no one's going to care about your health more than you will. I'll care just as much, but not more. And you want to do whatever it takes to get your health back. So that sounds like you, please book a session. What you'll be able to do, oh, well, people ask me, why do I do this? The reason we do this is because um, I feel that I have a responsibility now that I know this information to teach you it, because it's not being taught and it really is being suppressed for reasons that go beyond, oh, we just don't teach it. Just like I said, where 1% of what you can do can give you 99% of the results. 1% of whatever you can do to create the biggest impact on society with poor health and being reliant on prescriptions and other things is to not allow the information of bioavailable copper to be known to people. And it's suppressed for reasons. And we have iron filings in our foods for reasons. I digress, but there's too many facts that point to that. So it's my obligation to be sort of the Daniel or David versus Goliath and really knock on those, topple down and expose the truth for what it is, and empower and democratize healthcare so that you have the information to be able to impact your health. That's ultimately my bigger purpose and meaning, which means starting from the grassroots, one person at a time. But at the same time, I have a business to run, and this is what I do. And we attract clients that we know we can help. And this is also promoting the ability to get you to get help with the things that we do, because that's what we do. So if we feel we can help you, I'll let you know and what that will look like. And if there is, for any reason, we're not able to do any work together, you'll still walk away with a lot of value no matter what. So the spaces are limited, but this is where you would click on. You would, or you can actually, I don't think I don't know if you can click on that from here, but you'll basically, if you want to